All right, Luke chapter 22, as we dive in. The gospel writers devote most of their attention and most of their work to about 1,100 days of his life, the last 3.5 years. Of those 3.5 years, the primary interest of their writing and the centerpiece of the gospel message falls into one particular place, one particular time in Jesus' life, and that is the pinnacle of the day that he was crucified and the day that he walked out of the grave. That 24-hour plus period in between his death and resurrection, those two events seem to be the pinnacle of their writings and the pinnacle, obviously, of our faith. They believe that 24-hour or more period there was something that changed the world, something that would be able to drive forward the message of hope and forgiveness and redemption. Beginning Thursday evening and leading into sunset and sunset on Friday, we find this story of Jesus. That Jesus would eat his last meal, that he would pray in the garden, that he would be betrayed by one of his closest friends, that he would be deserted by all who followed him, that he would be convicted of blasphemy and charged with the cross, the crucifixion, that he would go before Pontius Pilate and be sentenced. He would be tortured by Roman guards, and then finally he would undergo crucifixion, the most gruesome death imaginable, and he would die and be buried. Of course, we know the story. The end of the story, 3 days later, he rises again. But this story is the story of really our lives, a story of our spiritual journey as well. In fact, the aim of this study over the next few weeks isn't just to get some nice details. It is to paint for us a theological and personal framework of what God desires to do in our lives through the cross of Christ, that you and I would be able to leave every week thinking and pondering what Jesus actually did for us, what he actually was trying to do for us in the cross. My hope is that at the end, when we get to Easter, is that we can proclaim like Paul proclaims in 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 2. When he says this, Paul says, I decided to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. 1 Corinthians 2:2, he says, listen, I decided, and I think we have this on the screen for you, I decided to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ. That's the proclamation that we desire, is that at the end of this, we would be able to say, God, there's nothing more that we know than you crucified, and of course, risen and coming again, that we would know your death. We would understand why you did that for us, that we would understand the magnitude, the pinnacle of the gospel, the good news, the completion of God's work to save us as we look at these last 24 hours. Now, as we dive in here to Luke 22, let me explain kind of what's happening to set the context. And we're going to kind of dramatize this a bit this morning. In other words, we're going to kind of walk through it piece by piece. We're not able to go through every detail of these moments, but we're going to look at one part of this story and kind of set a context so that as we read it, and our hope is that you would take inside your bulletin is something called the deeper faith, which is going to allow you to take these scriptures and go a little bit deeper in them. As you read this, you're going to be able to see this story in a way that you've never seen before, this actual historical moment where Jesus goes to the cross. Let me explain what's happening up until this point in Luke 22. What we find is Jesus has been ministering for 3.5 years. The center place of his ministry was a place called Galilee. Galilee was about 75 miles away from Jerusalem. And he was traveling around, and in every city he would come to, he would heal, he would do great works, and he would proclaim this message of freedom and the gospel founded in himself, that he would say things like, listen, he who believes in me has everlasting life. He would say that. He would say things like, I am the bread of life. If you eat of me, you'll never hunger again. He says these type of things all throughout the cities around Galilee. The week before, we find him making his way to Jerusalem. And the reason why he's making his way to Jerusalem is because of the Feast of Passover, the Feast of what is called unleavened bread. It is one of the most significant feasts in all of Israel's history. It is the initial feast in their working. It's called Passover. And it was a time where Jews would gather in Jerusalem together. And so Jesus, after doing all of these great works, made his way to Jerusalem, 75 miles. And as he entered Jerusalem, many of you know the story, he'd arrived into Jerusalem It says on the first day of the week. Now, I want to explain that for a moment because as we look over the next few weeks, it's real important for us to understand the concept of a day. I don't know if you've ever been asked this question. I've been asked this question before. Hey Dave, how did Jesus, if he died on Friday, how was he in the grave for 3 days if he rose on Sunday? You ever been asked that question? Well, the reason why that's confusing is because it comes from a Western mind where we have a day consists of 12 midnight to, or 12.001 or whatever, midnight to midnight, right? That's a day. That's what we consider a day. Well, in the Jewish mindset, they looked at a day a lot differently. A day actually began at sunset. So if we say that sunset in the Middle East, it's about 6 p.m., sunset begins at 6 p.m., the day begins at 6 p.m., and it ends at 6 p.m. the next day. So it actually goes from sundown to sundown. So give you just an example of this. Let's talk about the resurrection for a moment. In the Jewish mindset, Jesus was taken off the cross on Friday afternoon, put into the grave Friday afternoon before sundown. So he was in the grave on Friday. He was in the grave all day Saturday, and it says it was after sunrise, so he was already in the grave for Sunday because Sunday began at 6 p.m. on Saturday. All right, if that just confused you, it did me as well. Because the day started at sunset, right? He was in the grave on Friday before sunset, so it was Friday. Friday at 6 p.m. actually began the Jewish idea of Saturday. So he's in all day Saturday, and 6 p.m. Saturday would actually begin Sunday. And so he's in the grave for 3 days. And that's how we get this idea. So when we talk about the time frame of Jesus, it has to be looked at a bit through the Jewish mind because that was our understanding, that he was in the grave before sundown on Friday. So he was in the grave on Friday. It was the 3 days in between, and he was resurrected on the third day. That's why it makes perfect sense in their mind. They didn't even question it. There was nothing to question. We, in our Western mind, try to question these things without understanding the context. But Jesus was in the grave. This is their idea of the day. So when we talk about the last 24 hours, we're going to look at sunset. But to build that up, the week before, Jesus, on the first day of the week, rides into Jerusalem. Remember how he rides into Jerusalem? And we probably all have heard this. It's called the triumphal entry. He rides in on a donkey and a colt. He rides in like a king. And remember the people, they were casting down palm branches. They were proclaiming him to be phenomenal, fantastic, that he was a king. They were announcing him, and the word they use is the word Hosanna. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. The word Hosanna, the word in their language, Hoshiana, means to save us now. Literally, they were crying out for him to save them. Save us. And what their mindset was is to save them from Roman captivity. They wanted Jesus to come in and overthrow the Roman Empire because it was so evil. So here they were. They came in. Hosanna. Jesus comes in riding on this colt and donkey victorious. But everything changes. If you read the story, what you find is within that week, Jesus goes in the temple every single day, as was custom, and he was teaching. And finally, around the middle of that week, something goes wrong. Something goes haywire. He walks into Jerusalem, and what we find is he enters what's called the outer courts, and they were selling things. Now, there's nothing wrong with selling things in the temple. That was common. They sold sacrifices there, but what they were doing, they were cheating people. They were cheating people to make profit. They were cheating the people to make more profit for themselves. And you remember the story, right? What does Jesus do? Jesus makes himself a whip, and he overturns the tables, and he scatters them out. Well, because of that, now we have chaos. Now we have a big question. In fact, take a look at Luke chapter 22, and take a look at verse 1. It says, now the feast of unleavened bread, this is Passover, drew near. Luke 22:1, which is called the Passover. And the chief priests and scribes were seeking how to put him to death, for they feared the people. Now think about this for a moment. Seldom have the apparent fortunes of any historical figure changed so quickly. We have him riding into Jerusalem, Hosanna, the King, Jesus. And by the middle of the week, we've got these scribes and Pharisees are saying, we've got to figure out a way to put him to death. Things are getting pretty, as my kids like to say, awkward. Things are getting a little awkward in here. We go from him riding in triumphantly to them wanting to put him to death, but they feared because his popularity has gotten so great. Well, you know the story, right? And we're going to dive through this over the next few weeks. Judas ends up making a deal. We're going to talk about that in a few moments. but we find him kind of going into hiding a bit. In fact, we find him preparing for this Last Supper. Take a look at verse 7, and we're going to walk through this together and give this picture. In verse 7, we begin to see these last 24 hours of Jesus' life. Now, before we dive into the scriptures here, if you had 24 hours to live, what will you do? I mean, some of you had 24 hours to live. I'm going to Disney, right? Maybe you'd say that. You're probably not going to work, are you? If you had 24 hours to live, probably what most of us would do is we would probably sit down with our families and we would tell them all of the wisdom that we have. We would sit down and say, listen, I realize I'm not going to be with you that long, but I want to give you all of the wisdom that I can pour out. I want to reaffirm values. I want to tell you of important things. I want you to remember the standards of which I've tried to live. I'm going to talk about and reaffirm the mission that I want my kids and family to be on. That's what I would do, right? And I bet you, if we had 24 hours to live, most of us would do that by sitting over a meal. We'd probably think, what do I want to eat? And we would get, like, I'm not having steak. I'm having whatever I want. Lobster. It's my last meal, right? I'm going to die, so I'm going to sit down with all the people I love. I'm going to tell them what's important. I'm going to reaffirm my mission, and I'm probably going to do it over a meal. Well, Jesus did just that. He sat down with his closest friends over this meal, the Passover meal. He sits down with them, and by the way, this idea of the last meal is a little bit of a neat kind of a weird thing in our culture, because we think about any convicted criminal. What do we want to know about any convicted criminal? So you know, the death penalty, whether you agree with it or not, isn't the point. In 32 states, it's still legal to have the death penalty. 32 states still have it as a legal right. So there are people that are put to death, and they're usually put to death now by lethal injection. Now, if somebody's being ready to be put to death, what the newspaper, I don't know if you ever read this, the newspaper really focuses on, what was their last meal, I wonder? I don't know why that is. I think we're a bit morbid. Who cares what the last meal of a murderer is? But this is what we do, right? We want to know, what did they eat? In fact, there was a guy back in 1983 named David Castillo. Listen to this. He was convicted of murder. He was about ready to be put to death by lethal injection. And so his last meal, and it was the cover of the New York Times, was his last meal. And here's why. I mean, this is kind of is sad, actually, but it's a bit hilarious. He ate 24 tacos, 2 cheeseburgers, 2 whole onions, 5 jalapeno peppers, 6 enchiladas, 6 tostadas, 1 quart of milk, and 1 chocolate milkshake. How's that for a Last Supper? I don't think he cared what people thought of him after that. Some of you get that later. That's supposed to be funny right there. Mixing tacos and milkshake, I don't know what that does to you, but I know what that does to me. You don't drink milkshakes and eat tacos, all right? That's a bad combination. But he was going to be put to death, so who cares, right? I mean, so be it. We're enthralled with this idea of the last meal, right? The last meal. Now, think about this for a moment. Here's Jesus, who has spent with 12 men 3.5 years, day and night. They have probably eaten over 1,000 meals together. But this meal is going to be different. And it's not just because it's the Passover meal. It is because this meal is going to take a whole new meaning, because it's going to be their last meal with him, but it's also become the most important meal probably ever eaten by these men. As we're going to see in a moment, this is going to be a meal that ends all meals, and the primary purpose of this meal isn't to eat food. The primary purpose is to have a memorial. It is to remember. It is to draw into memory something of great importance, as we're going to see. Now take a look at what happens, verse 7. It says, then came the day of unleavened bread. This is the Passover. That's another name for it, on which the Passover lamb had to be sacrificed. So Jesus sent Peter and John, saying, go and prepare the Passover for us, that we may eat of it. And they said to him, where will you have us prepare it? Here they are in this city they hadn't been too often. I mean, he was in Jerusalem off and on, but not to stay. And he said to them, behold, when you have entered the city, a man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Follow him into the house that he enters, and tell the master of the house that the teacher says to you, where is the guest room where I may eat the Passover with my disciples? And he will show you a large upper room that is furnished and prepared. And they went and found it just as he had told them, and they prepared the Passover. And this is really interesting here. So they're getting ready for the Passover meal, and we're going to talk about this in a moment. This is the number one meal of the Jewish people of the feast. The first one, and also the most important. And he sends Peter and John, two of the most closest to Jesus, and he says, hey, you guys go prepare the Passover meal. He says, here's what I want you to do. I want you to go into the city of Jerusalem, huge city. It's the capital city of the Israel people. It's the major city of the day. And I want you to find a man carrying a water jug. Now, this is supposed to be a bit humorous to us because in their day, men did not carry water jugs. Now, that's not sexist or meant to be a downplay. It was just a custom that was women. Women would carry the water jugs. By the way, this is true in still many cultures around the world. If you go to Africa, I know we had a team that went to Uganda. There, you would look down the street and there would be women who would be carrying water jugs on their heads. You go to some Latin American countries and many poor countries, the women, they do this throughout the day. They go get water from wells and they carry it. Well, it was the same in the Middle East in their day. The women would go get the water. So this is meant to be kind of funny when they would hear Jesus say, hey, you're going to find a man, and he's going to be carrying a water jug, and it's going to be about the middle of the day, and he's going to be carrying a water jug on his with him. It's going to stand out. It's going to be like this one man in the midst of all these women coming to the well. That's the picture here. And it's not going to be that confusing. You're going to find him. When you find him, follow him. It almost seems stalker-like what Jesus asked them to do. Follow him into his master's house. Now, the idea was that this was probably a servant. And you're going to follow him to his master's house, and you're going to tell him that the teacher needs a place to have the Passover with his disciples. Now, there are some scholars that say, well, Jesus kind of had this all set up beforehand, or this was miraculous. To me, it doesn't really matter whether it's miraculous or not. It's a bit funny. They go there. Hey, the teacher said, hey, we're going to come to your house and have the Passover. All right, come on in. And it all works out. And what we know is this had to be a wealthy person because this had to be a pretty big house. I want you to think about this. An upper room, a place of privacy, a place that could be hidden. And why we know he's wealthy, because we know in the book of Acts chapter 2, remember Jesus ascends and the disciples are waiting in the upper room, and their number is how many? 120. So this room has to be big enough for some parties. They're fitting 120 people praying in there in the book of Acts. This is going to be a pretty big room. And so they get up there and they begin to prepare. They begin to prepare. Now, what we're not told is what all the preparation is, because as readers would read this, they understand the preparation. But here's how it works. It takes hours to prepare for the Passover. It takes hours because they have to go to the temple. This is really interesting. Peter and John, they would have gone to the upper room, made sure everything is set up. They would have situated the tables the way it's supposed to be. And we're going to talk about that in a moment. And then they would go to the temple because they had to get the lamb. They had to get the food. They had to get the unleavened bread. So they would go to the temple and there would be priests. Now, what we know, I mean, this is really interesting. I'm just kind of building the picture here for us. Is what we gather is that this idea of the Passover lambs was huge in Israel. I mean, this was one time a year they did this. This was a huge feast. In fact, scholars would say that at any given year, there would be about 250,000, 250,000 lambs that would be killed. You talk about shepherds, there were a lot of shepherds. You talk about being in the fields with sheep, there were a lot of them. In fact, in a typical Passover season, scholars say there would be about 600 priests killing an average of 4 lambs every minute over a 2-hour period. That's how it would happen. 600 priests they would all come to Jerusalem to prepare for this feast. And what they would do is they would take this, it could be a lamb or a goat, and they would slit it, they would drain its blood, they would then cook it. And a portion of that would be for the priests, a portion of that blood would be used to pour over the altar of forgiveness, over the altar of sacrifice, and then the lamb would be basted and oiled and cooked, and then given to the family. And so this whole process was being done. It was kind of like, a market where this would happen outside of the temple area, and the disciples had to wait. And so by the time they probably got to the actual time of the Passover, it was 3 hours later. By the time they make the lamb and all that stuff that they had to do, gather everything together, go to the temple, wait in line, get the blood drained, all that stuff. And all of that was meant to be a picture. It was all, in fact, kind of interesting. And I like kind of stuff like this because in the temple, even today, if you go to Israel, in the temple, there's this little drainage trough. And you can't see the temple. You can only see one wall. But there's still this drainage trough that flows into a valley called the Kidron Valley, where it says that during Passover season, the blood would just flow there like a river. That's how much sacrifice was happening, and that's how God set it up, as we're going to see in a moment. Now, let's go to the actual supper. So here they are, they're prepared. They take a few hours, and now we get to sundown. We get to sunset. This would have been a sundown on Thursday, which for them, in their mind, would have began Friday. Verse 14, and when the hour came, they came into the room, of course, and they reclined at the table and the apostles with him. Now, I want to take a moment and describe what this looks like. And again, we're setting the scene here for these last 24 hours. This is really the details that you and I can just read past and we don't see it. And I want to kind of play this out. In the first century, it was a custom in rooms to have dinners, a lot of things sent to dinners. There's nothing greater, by the way. I love sitting down to dinner with my family. I love interacting with the boys and laughing with them and eating. And as a family, that's something, kind of a lost art in our culture, isn't it? To sit down at a table at a meal together at a table. We love doing that as a family. We think it's an important thing. And we sit down and we laugh together and talk together. And sometimes it leads to a couple hours. Sometimes it's like, Dad, can we get up now? We're done eating. We want to go play. Sure, so we have this play out in our home. But in their day, a lot of the tables, especially of a group this size, was shaped in a U. This is well documented. So the image that you and I have of the Passover looks like this. Take a look at this picture. It's of Da Vinci's The Last Supper. You probably, when you think of The Last Supper, you think of this. I think of this. This is made by Da Vinci, obviously, during the Enlightenment artistic years, and it's a great picture and painting that he made. But there's some interesting things. It's hard to see. This is a picture of the original, so it's hard to see. But there's a couple things that just don't make sense to us, that weren't accurate. A lot of people look at this as an accurate picture. First of all, notice the window in the back. What is outside? What's happening outside? It's daytime. What we find in the scripture is actually it was nighttime when this happened. It was at sundown. Also notice, if you can look, you can't really see very well, they're wearing sandals. The custom is in Jewish homes, even today, this has been for centuries, is when you walk into their home, you take your shoes off. You don't wear your shoes. By the way, you don't do this in a lot of cultures today. You take your shoes off at the door. In fact, what they would have is a little pitcher, because it was so dusty, the roads were made of dirt and dust. It was so dusty that you would then take a pitcher, and there would be usually a servant who would be hired to wash guests' feet as they come in. And if you didn't have a servant, you would then have a little pail at the front, and you would wash your own feet. And if you were the first one in the door, you would then wash the person behind you feet. So it was always, that's where we get the idea, no, you first. No, you first. All right, I'm kidding. That's not where it came from, but it sounds cool. No, you go first. I don't want to wash your feet. And that was a custom. Now, please know, the writers tell us that no one washes anybody's feet, and Jesus takes note of this. When you read John 13, you find out Jesus actually saw that they did not wash each other's feet, as was custom. They walked in and sat down. This wasn't their room. They were guests in this house. The table would have been laid out in the U shape. This would have been custom. This is well documented. It wasn't in a straight line. In fact, if you look at Da Vinci's picture, they have actually bread, normal bread. Remember, the feast didn't have normal bread. It had unleavened bread. So Da Vinci's picture is not a great picture of the Last Supper. It's a beautiful picture. Don't cast Da Vinci aside. He's an artist, but this is a little bit off of the way it really looked, because this is the way it would have been shaped into U, probably much bigger than this, to fit 12 guys. How they would sit, it says they recline. Here's why. When they would come in, they would sit at the table like this, and this image just gives us a perspective. They would come in, and this is the way they sat around tables, is kind of like reclining. They would have pillows, and they would sit a lot like this. They would have one hand on the table leaning, and the other hand would be used to eat and pass, and they would talk and laugh, and they could turn around and laugh at each other, and they would sit like this. Now, this makes perfect sense if you ever read the Gospels, because right before this, Jesus is in the house of Simon the leper, and a woman comes in. They're having a meal. A woman comes in with an alabaster jar. Remember that story? And breaks it and pours it upon his feet. This makes perfect sense to almost all the stories that we read about women who washed the feet of Jesus or wept over Jesus' feet. Here's why. They would come into the house. All he would have to do is turn this way. He would be able to look at them as they washed their feet and talk with them. So this is the way it worked. They were reclining at the table much like this. They would just be hanging out. Hey, how you doing? Chilling? It was very accustomed for them just to be relaxing like this. That's why the word incline here has the idea they're kind of laying around. They're lounging. They're not just sitting. It's not proper. It's comfortable. It's hanging out. Now, what's even more interesting is the way they would sit. There was a custom as to the way you would sit in a home. This is real interesting. And it gives light to what we read in the Bible. That's the whole point of this, is we're digging out details that we don't see written, but we know historically are true. In a U-shaped format, this is a tri shape of the table, which was customary, the U shape. And the reason why it was U-shaped, by the way, is so that the servant could come serve each person. Some of you are like, that works. We need that in our home. The problem is who's serving. And so it makes sense. How they would be positioned is this way. On the right-hand side of the table, and of course you're facing it, it's the left, but it's the right-hand side if you're sitting at it, would be the host. The host would take what is called position 2. The reason why is because the youngest person of the group or the family would sit in position 1. You know why the youngest person would sit in position 1? Because they had to get up and get the drinks. They had to get up and get the food. Hey, I don't know in your house, in my house, the youngest, my older boys will look at my youngest and go, hey, can you go do this for me? No, that's your job. No, I'm giving you the job now, right? They've learned this language. My boys do this. So the youngest would be sitting here. And who was the youngest disciple? John. And we know this. So John was sitting here. The host of this party or this meal would be sitting here, which would be Jesus. Now, who would be sitting next would be the person of great honor. The reason they would be of great honor is because they would be receiving the food being passed by the host. I know what everybody here is thinking. It had to be Peter. Peter was the closest. No, actually, Peter wasn't, because Peter was considered the next leader under Jesus. And this is kind of interesting. The next leader under Jesus actually would sit on the opposite side. So let me just, if you were dad, mom would sit over here. Some of you are like, that's a good deal. I'm just kidding. That's not good. I always like sitting beside my wife. I like, get snuggling up a little bit. I like that. Peter would be sitting here. Here's why. Peter was kind of the second in command. He was kind of the leader of the disciples. The reason they would sit here is this is the other side of honor, and he would be able to look directly over to the master into his eyes as they talk. So this is the image that we get. Meaning, from every indication, we're going to come back to this in a moment, the person beside Jesus would have been Judas. He was the keeper of the money. He made the financial decisions for the group. And as we see, if you read the Gospels, this makes perfect sense. And I'm going to show you in a moment as to why. Now, take a look. We're going to read on here about what happens next. Again, we're just painting a picture of this Last Supper for a moment. Take a look. So here they are, verse 14. And when the hour came, they reclined at the table, and the apostles with him. And he said to them, I have earnestly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. For I tell you, I will not eat it until it is finished and fulfilled in the kingdom of God. And he took the cup, and when he had given thanks, he said, take this and divide it among yourselves, for I tell you that from now on I will not drink of the fruit of the vine until the kingdom of God comes. And he took the bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and gave it to them, saying, this is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me. He likewise takes the cup after they had eaten, saying, this is the cup that is poured out for you as the new covenant in my blood. He says, take this, do this in the same way. Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 11, do this in remembrance of me. Now let me explain what's happening here. The meal they're about to take, the meal they're partaking is called the Passover. What does this even mean? And this morning we're going to partake of the Lord's Supper. What does that mean? What does that look like? And then we're going to spend some time in worshiping Christ. What does that even reference? Well, let me go back, and we're not going to study this out all the way because we don't have time in this setting. But let me just say to you, if you go back to Exodus, read Exodus chapter 1 through Exodus chapter 12. You remember the story of Exodus? By the way, if you've ever seen the Ten Commandments with Charlton Heston, you get the picture of this. Or if you've seen Prince of Egypt, you get the picture of this. Remember, God calls Moses, a prince of Egypt. God calls Moses out and says, I want you to go deliver my people out of the hand of Pharaoh, out of the land of Egypt. Remember, they're in bondage in Egypt. In fact, they're making bricks out of straw. It's hard labor. And God's people, he goes to Moses and says, I want you to deliver my people from the hand of Pharaoh. So Moses goes. Reluctantly, but he goes. And remember, Moses says, let my people go. Pharaoh says, no, I'm not letting your people, because they're not your people, they're my people. And I'm going to keep them. And what ends up happening? He ends up increasing their workload. Moses comes back again. So God finally intervenes and says this, all right, I'm going to send 10 plagues which has never been seen. Remember, he sends these 10 plagues, and finally, in the 10th plague, God says, I'm going to send a plague that will absolutely Pharaoh's going to break, and God knows this. God is building to this moment. And he says, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to send the death angel into Egypt, and every firstborn is going to die. Now, remember, Pharaoh, in any king's mind, it's true in any dictator's mind, you want to have your children, because children are going to reign in your behalf, and you don't trust other people to reign after you, because if other people reign, they can bash your name. By the way, isn't it true? I think it's been in the history of the United States, every president blames the previous president for the problems, right? Well, if it's your son's not going to do that. So to have a son was looked at as huge for a king or a pharaoh. So here is Pharaoh, and he hears Moses say, God is going to send his death angel into the land of Egypt, and every firstborn is going to die, including yours. Read the story. He even points out, Pharaoh, even your kin are going to die. And Pharaoh says, I'm not letting my people go. They're my people. They're doing my work. They're building things for me. I'm not going to let them go. So what does God do? God sends the death angel. But before he does, he says to the people of Israel, he says, here's what I want you to do. I want you to commemorate this night before it ever begins with a feast. But here's what's going to happen. I want you to make bread, but you're going to have to make it quickly, so don't let it leaven. It's going to be unleavened bread. I want you to take a lamb, and I want you to slit the lamb, pour out the blood, then bake the lamb. But I want you to take the blood, and with hyssop, I want you to put it over the doorpost of the house. Why? Because when my death angel passes over the area, over Egypt, those who have the blood on the doorpost, I will pass over. The word in Hebrew is the word Pasach, which is where we get our word Passover. It's the idea the angel is not going to come to that house. You're going to be safe under the blood of the lamb. You're going to find safety. And what happened? Of course, the 10th plague came, death came over to Egypt, and the Jewish people, Israel, was saved because they put the lamb's blood on the doorpost. They ate unleavened bread, and they remembered with bitter herbs what their work that was being done in Egypt. And finally, Pharaoh says, take them. They're free to go. Now, in Exodus 12, and then later in Leviticus and Numbers, God tells the Jewish people to remember that. By the way, there's something in the Bible, and we've talked about this before, there's something that God has about remembering what he has done, remembering. There is something about not forgetting what happens. By the way, isn't this true even as a country? It's important to remember history. It's important to remember how we've gotten where we've gotten so that we don't go back to where we were. God knows that. God knows this about us. And even Jesus here knows this about his disciples. And he says, I want you to remember this. This Passover, this idea of this Passover table, this Passover feast, which is to commemorate. Now, the whole point of the Passover, the whole point was two things. First of all, if you had the blood in your doorposts, God was passing over you, passing over your sin. But if you didn't have the blood in your doorposts, your sin is going to pass you over. It's going to pass you on. You're going to die off. In fact, so this picture that I have is either God's going to remove your sin or you're going to remove, or sin will remove you from God. That's the image we get. The Passover meal was all about freedom, all about freedom. It was all about the freedom of bondage, freedom from slavery. That's the Passover. In essence, it's all about freedom from bondage, and they would commemorate that for 3,000, 4,000 years, even to the time of Jesus. Now, Jesus takes it and transforms it into a deeper way. Now, I want you to consider this morning. This is where we want to end our time and consider this. Jesus takes this Passover meal that had been done for thousands of years to remember that God had delivered his people from Egypt. But Jesus takes it and transforms it into even a deeper meaning. Because the question is, what type of slavery were the disciples struggling with? Right? I mean, is the Passover just to remember, oh, yeah, we got out of Egypt. We're good. We're a nation now. Right? Bondage. We're out of bondage. Jesus understood that there was a deeper bondage than just Egypt. And in this room this morning, there's a deeper bondage than just a location. In fact, I want you to see this. Don't miss this story. Because this blows my mind, what Jesus did in this moment, his Last Supper. Notice it goes on. We end it there at verse 20, right? He says, this bread, this unleavened bread now represents my body which is going to be poured out on the cross. My body, which is going to become a sacrifice for you. This cup, which is made up of the fruit of the vine, is representing my blood. It's red. It's like my blood, which I'm going to shed. Now, the question is, why does he change it to be not just about coming out of Egypt and the blood of the lamb on the doorpost? It's because he's demonstrating that there's a deeper bondage. Take a look at what he says next. I find this no accident here. He says, but, verse 21, but behold, the hand of him who betrays me is with me on this table. Now, who is that? It's Judas. For the Son of Man goes as it has been determined, but woe to that man by whom he was betrayed. And they began to question one another, which of them it could be who was going to do this. Now, John, in the Gospel of John, gives us a little bit different information, the same information, but a little bit more detail. In fact, Jesus, sitting at the position number 2, says, take this cup. This represents the blood. It's my covenant to you. As the covenant was to Israel back in the Passover, this is now my covenant, that I'm going to give you freedom. That's what this is all about. This is all about freedom. He says, but one of you is going to betray me. John writes that everybody's saying, is it I? Is it I? Who is it that's going to betray? Did I do it? Am I doing it? And somewhere along the line, John writes that Peter, who's sitting over here, looks over and says, John, ask him who. Ask him who it is. And John writes, and if you go back and read John, it says, leans into the breasts of Jesus and says, Jesus, who is it? And Jesus responds, it's the one who dips my hand in the cup after me. Now, in order for the person to dip the cup after him, it had to be the one sitting next to him who was going to serve. Do you see that? So here's Judas, the man of authority, the money keeper, and Jesus sitting here, and he takes the cup and he passes it to the one sitting next to him. He dips his hand in the bread, and after that he says, one of you is going to betray me. At that point, we get the idea that Judas is now mad, upset. It says that Satan comes into him and he leaves. Now, I want you to think about this. So we see around this table bondage. We see someone enslaved. Judas is enslaved with self-centeredness. The first thing we see about slavery is, by the way, this idea of freedom in things is a pretty powerful thing. Freedom is a wonderful word, but a dangerous concept. Give a 16-year-old keys to the car. Freedom! Danger. Right? You hear kids say this all the time. I can't wait till I'm 18. I'm going to have freedom. And all of us who are now older than 18, we go, you got to learn a lot, buddy. Because you know what happens, right? Freedom isn't actually freedom. You just get put under another set of bondage. It used to be your parents, now it's a job. It used to be never having to worry about money, and now you got bills. I love it because most people that want freedom, I'm going to join the military. Go ahead. Join the military. Find your freedom there. You follow what I'm saying. We all have this idea of freedom. Not, please, if you're young in here, I'm not saying, but you're going to say that. I can't wait to be 18. I'm going to get out on my own and have freedom. There's never really any freedom, ultimately. You're always in bondage to something or someone. And if you thought marriage when I said that, you... Well, what happens? Think about it for a moment. Here's Judas, who just makes a decision. Now, the decision he makes is to take 30 pieces of silver. He goes to the chief priests. He goes to the Pharisees, and he says, hey, guys, I can get you Jesus in private where no one's going to know that you've taken him. I can make it where it doesn't become a scene because I can do it in the middle of the night because I'm close to him. Will you make a deal with me? Give me 30 pieces of silver. Now, in our day today, 30 pieces of silver in their economy would have been about $10,000 in our day. So Judas, who's the money keeper, says, I want to make a financial deal. Now, many people believe Judas was a zealot. He wanted Rome to be overthrown, and some believe that he actually manipulated this to try to get Jesus to overthrow Rome. I don't have that kind of sympathy for Judas. I actually believe what Judas did is what many of us do in our lives, is that we choose our self-centered living over the choice to live our lives for Christ. Judas had a choice, his political stance or Jesus. Judas had a choice, his religious stance or Jesus. He had a choice, right? And in the end, he made the choice to say, I want what I want. I want $10,000. I want money and power and fame. And in the end, it took his life. Remember that. But what he did is he was in bondage over self-centered living. He was in bondage to himself. Folks, there are some of us here this morning, we are in bondage to ourselves. Yet maybe it's not going to end as badly as it ends for Judas. But you're in bondage to your way and your life and your things, and you think it's going to end somewhere good. And in the end, when we're in bondage to self, it always ends bad. I mean, think about it. When we set ourselves up to be God, we are horrible gods. Now, no one here is saying, I want to be God. We would never say that, and yet we live our lives as if we have made ourselves our God. And in the end, that leads to nowhere. Notice what else happens here. I think we get another view of slavery that's deeper than just national slavery out of Egypt. Take a look at what happens. So here he says, someone's going to deny me. Now watch this, verse 24. A dispute also arose among them as to which of them was to be regarded as the greatest. And he said, the king of the Gentiles exercised lordship over them, and those in authority over them are called benefactors. But not so with you, rather let the greatest among you become as the youngest. It goes on, and Simon Peter ends up saying, listen, if everybody denies you, Jesus, I'm never going to deny you. And at the end here, he tells him, verse 34, Jesus says, I tell you, Peter, the rooster will not crow this day until you deny me 3 times. Do you just see what happened? Jesus is sitting here, he says, hey, one of you are going to betray me. Is it I? Is it I? Is it I? Finally, they realize it's Judas, and he gets up and walks out. Then they begin to have an argument over who's the greatest. Does this make sense to you? Do you see where the slavery is? Slavery to self-centered living. And I would dare say that many of us live in a slavery to our status, our worth, our self-worth, or a false sense of one's worth. We begin to try to define our status. And by the way, a lot of this is based upon fear, right? I want to be accepted. I want to be good. I want to look better. By the way, I hate to say this, is so sad to say, but if you ever get pastors together, this becomes a nuisance. One of the first questions that pastors ask each other, how many people do you have at your church? I always answer like 100,532. Because I think it's sad that we have to compete when we're trying to reach people for the kingdom. I celebrate when other churches, I pray for other churches, I pray for pastors. In fact, I text pastors every morning to tell them I'm praying for them this morning as they proclaim the gospel. Why? Because I don't want to compete about this. This is about the kingdom, right? But it is in our nature to do that. I mean, I started this service by saying, I could be the most decorated. That's what we do, don't we? One of the decorated athletes in FCF history, basketball, church basketball. This is what we do, right? We fight for status. We fight for worth. We fight to get accepted. We fight and for some of you, that has led to being defined by what somebody else has said to you. Some of you, it's being defined by your fear. Some of you, it's being defined by abuse and pain and hurt. You're allowing the things of the world to define you. Now, please know, I'm not saying those things were all caused by you or your fault. What I'm saying is you are allowing those things in your life to define who you are. And in the end, that's slavery. It's becoming more important than what can get you out of that, which is Christ. And so Jesus here says, right around this table, I hope we can grasp this picture. We've got a guy who's going to betray him. We've got a man who's second in command of the group who's going to deny him 3 times. And we have an entire others, except for one who happened to be the youngest, which didn't even make sense, are all going to desert him. They're all going to leave him. No one is going to be standing at the foot of the cross except for John. They're all going to be scattered, it says. And yet he sits here at this table with them, his last meal. And he says, listen, this bread is not about coming out of Egypt. This bread is about the freedom that I bring you. This is my body, which is broken for you. This cup it's not the cup of reminding. By the way, I love the fact it was called the cup of redemption. It was the 4th cup in the Passover meal. And he grabs it and he says, this is the last cup of the Passover meal. It is a reminder of the redemption of God. But this cup doesn't mean the redemption of Israel out of Egypt, because guess what? That was history. This is a cup now about my blood, which is shed for you to get you out of bondage. And it's not the bondage of Egypt. It's a bondage of self-centered living. It's a bondage of status and worth that you're fighting for. And that's what obviously the disciples were fighting right there for it. Man, they wanted to be good. They wanted to find themselves. And Jesus says, listen, you can't. By the way, I love the fact that he answers this in two different ways, and we don't have time to develop it all, but Jesus answers this by two ways. First of all, he says, I want to show you there's freedom by serving. I love the picture that Jesus gets down. In John 13, John writes, he gets down and he takes the pitcher of water and he washes their feet. He says there's freedom when you serve. In fact, I would dare say to you this morning that if you really want to know what freedom is actually attaining a higher grader of servitude. I mean, right? I mean, what ultimate freedom is when you get a greater sense of serving. I mean, and here's the example I give. Take our kids, for example. I can't wait till I'm free. I can't wait till I'm 18. I can't wait till I do what I want to do. I can't wait till I live my life. And we all laugh about that because we know what happens. You get that old and then you got bills and you got houses and you get... But what happens? The service becomes greater, doesn't it? Like I get to serve my wife. I get to serve my kids. I get to serve my family, right? The service becomes a greater picture of servitude. This is the way Jesus... By the way, the number one word he uses throughout the Bible to describe Christians is the word doulos, servant, slave. Why? Because when you have a master like Jesus, when you have a master as great as Christ has been to us, who is gracious and merciful and who sacrificed himself, you can't help but to serve him. Can't help but to serve him. My wife doesn't love me because I look at her and be like, woman, you better love me. Woman, I said get food on the table. What are you doing? Woman, I said... she doesn't love me because of that. She loves her. Man, she is willing to serve me, and she is a servant-hearted woman, and she serves me because I have learned to love her deeply, love her, and lead her, and be tender with her, and lead her along in life. And guess what? I'm going to tell you guys, if you're out there, I'm going to tell you this. As a husband, my wife serves me and loves me, not because I'm great in demanding it, but because I demonstrate a deep love for her. And she gets servant, and vice versa, by the way. I serve her because I get her love. I understand it. I grasp it and it overwhelms me, and I want to serve her. I can't help but to serve her. She's so great to me. That's the image here, right? Man, Christ, you went to the cross for me. I'm in bondage, and you're offering me freedom. Why can I not serve you? But secondly, not only is freedom in serving, but I believe he answers this and says there's freedom, ultimately independence. Independence. Now, I want you, this is seen all throughout. Read the book of Galatians. This is in the book of Galatians. This idea of freedom is actually dependence. Because I'm going to depend on something to get that freedom. You know, we as a country say we have the Declaration of Independence, which meant we became dependent upon the Declaration. It really wasn't a declaration of independence. It was actually a declaration of dependence on our country. Really, freedom is all about who you depend on. I mean, we feel freedom in our country because we depend on a mighty military, the number one military in the world. We feel secure in our freedom because we have police officers and ambulance drivers and firefighters who keep us safe, right? And so we know if something happens, we can have an ambulance at our house pretty quickly most of the time. We feel safe because there's police officers who are giving their life for our sake. We feel safe. Why? Because we are dependent. Jesus here says, listen, if you want freedom, it is in my body which is broken and my blood which is shed. By depending on me, there is freedom. Think about this for a moment. He is sitting around the room. Betrayer, deniers, all who will leave him. And he says, I love John 15:15. He says to them these words. He says, this is a commandment that you love one another as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, and he laid down his life for his friends. You are my friends. Think about that for a moment. He says, you're my friends. What did he just do? He said, I'm going to offer you freedom. Because you who will leave me and desert me and abandon me and deny me, I'm paying for it. I'm going to go to the cross for you so that you may do what I command you. No longer do I call you servants. He says, I call you friends. I love, he says in John 8, Jesus said this, and I wonder if these things came to their minds as they thought about this supper. He said, truly, truly, I say to you, everyone who practices sin is a slave to sin. The slave does not remain in the house forever, but the Son remains forever. So if the Son sets you free, you are free indeed. Jesus said, man, there's freedom, but it's founded in dependence upon him. And that what he did on the cross is enough, and what he did by rising again is enough. Galatians says it this way, stand firm in the freedom. For freedom Christ has set us free. Stand firm, therefore, and do not submit again to a yoke of slavery. He says, listen, there is freedom available. That's what this meal is all about. That's what the Last Supper was all about, was about freedom. And here he was sitting around with a group of vagabonds who were all going to deny him, all going to leave him, all going to fall away from him. And he says, listen, you're in bondage right now. You're in bondage, but there is freedom in what I'm about to do on the cross. And I want you to remember that. And I dare say, if you were to look up the writings of Peter and the writings of these apostles, the thing they kept running back to is this moment where he declares to them, this meal is all about freedom. Stand fast in that freedom. Don't submit again. What is it freedom from? And it's freedom from myself. Freedom from the limitations of my human effort. Freedom from guilt and shame. Freedom from the tyranny of other people's opinions of me and expectations of me and demands of me. It's freedom to obey and freedom to love and freedom to forgive, even those who I can't forgive. It's freedom to live beyond what I can and allow God to have his way. It's freedom to serve and glorify Christ. All because of his grace, all because of his sacrifice. Are you in bondage? Or are you living in that freedom? I love history. I love hearing the stories, and especially, I don't know about you, but right now in the news, when you follow what's happening with the Ukraine and Crimea and those things over there, I can't help but to think of that moment. And I remember I was just a little guy, but I never will forget watching it in 1987. Remember Ronald Reagan when he was speaking, and he said, overlooking the wall there in Berlin, Germany, which represented communism, and he said, Gorbachev, tear down these walls. Remember that? Just a powerful moment. Tear down these walls. And 2 years later, those walls came tumbling down. And now we see these things heightened in our world, and we wonder what's happening. Is this a new strand of communism? What does that look like? What are the walls in your life? Is your life wrapped in yourself? Is our life wrapped in our fight for status and worth? Is it wrapped in I want to get something that makes me feel fulfilled? Jesus says, listen, there's no other satisfaction but in me. Because in the end, that satisfaction that you look for is never going to last. There's always going to have to be something else. You become a slave to something else and something else and something else, and you find yourself in slavery at all times. So why not switch the object of your slavery? That's what he was offering to these men sitting around this room. He was offering freedom in a meal that meant freedom. He says, now there's freedom in me. Let's stand together as we pray this morning.